DJ!
Are you done mixing yet?
Your DJ has only just begun.
What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? It's your boy DJ Psych Shafe here, dropping knowledge bombs on your dome free of charge every single day. So let's get our notebooks out, put our distraction devices away, and let's think a little bit about agonists to start. Pause the video, a little bit of review to kick it off. Ready, go. Now that you've done some review all the way back to blow up, because we are psychologists, we know that creating some context before we learn things is going to increase our ability to retain that information. So let's go ahead and develop some context first. Pause this video, go back to that first reading that we did earlier this week with the handwritten notes on it, and it told you to stop midway through. Go ahead and finish that reading so that we can start to talk about the effects of stereotypes today. Okay, so we are now on to the second part of this key concept, focusing on the effects of stereotypes, and the key term that you need to be familiar with here is stereotype threat. And basically what this is you are threatened by the stereotype of your particular in-group. Members of your in-group, an out-group member might make a stereotype about you and your in-group members, and that can psychologically affect the way you think about yourself, and it can also affect the way that you behave. This can explain a wide variety of things as far as test scores or athletic abilities, and a lot of times it increases the anxiety of you and your in-group members when people create stereotypes about you. And it oftentimes leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is something we have heard when we were talking about the depression research in BLOA, right? If you just kind of believe it into existence, and if people start to make stereotypes negatively about you and your in-group, you can sometimes just start to believe that into existence, and that's going to decrease your performance and the way that you think about yourself. And it could be anything as far as music or sports or school, and so that is an example of what can happen when a stereotype is in place, and that's an example of a stereotype threat. A really easy way to think about stereotype threat is to think back to the brown-eyed, blue-eyed experiment that we looked at the beginning of SCLOA. We're not going to rewatch it. I don't expect you to rewatch it now, but if you want to go back and if you forget the example I'm talking about, feel free to do that. I'm sure you have plenty of time. But if you remember the second group, the brown-eyed group, when they were doing flashcards, their time got slower by about 1.5 minutes, and nothing else changed other than that they were in the quote-unquote bad group or the worst group that day. And so that's an example of them having a negative stereotype placed upon them and it negatively affecting their performance or their behavior in academics. So that's just one example that we've talked about that you can see pretty clearly and pretty easily an example of stereotype threat. So I mentioned this earlier, and this is really kind of the second prong of stereotype threat, but stereotype threat often leads to self-fulfilling prophecies. Again, like I mentioned before, we talked about this in BLOA with depression, but when people say that your group can't do this or your group is, too dumb or too non-athletic or can't do this or are bad drivers or whatever the case may be, there starts to be a belief that, well, if that's what they say about members of my in-group, maybe that's true. And then you start to believe in those things and you start to carry out actions that reflect those stereotypes. So stereotype threat leads to self-fulfilling prophecies, which can affect your behavior. So to support stereotype threat, we are going to use one new study and one old study. So we're going to look at the new study first, and it is Steele and Aronson, which investigates stereotype threat into academics. So they're going to take college students, white and black college students, and they are going to give them questions from the GRE, which is a test that you'd have to take to get into grad school. The first set of students, they say that this is a measure of their intellect. And they see that there's a wide achievement gap. The second time they give the test to a different set of white and black students, they say that this is just a prerequisite drill and it's not a measure of intelligence. And the whites and black students do exactly the same. So, in education, there's this constant discussion of the achievement gap and how white students are particularly way further from black students, and how can we shrink the achievement gap, and how can we bring those two races closer together in academics. And so unfortunately that stereotype is constantly flooded the airways, and in media it's talked about. And so oftentimes black students feel like there is an achievement gap and I'm supposed to be learning less and not be able to do these things. So when they were presented with these questions and they said, hey, this is a measure of your intellect, this piece of research shows that the stereotype threat affected their behavior and they lived up to that achievement gap. They fulfilled that prophecy. When the questions from the same test were given to a separate set where it was said, hey, this isn't about intelligence, then there's no stereotype threat there. There's no achievement gap that the black students would be thinking about. And then the whites and black students did equally as well. So this is your first piece of research. You can read more about it and ask questions if that doesn't make sense. Another study that we are going to use is, we're going back to Martin and Halverson. And we are going to focus on memory distortion and on how stereotypes affect your memory. So the first concept we're looking at is stereotype threat. That's the first effect, so how stereotypes can affect your actual performance. The second component of this is how stereotypes can affect your memory and memory distortion. So we're just going to reuse Martin and Halverson. If you remember, the children's memory was distorted to fit their gender schemas and their gender stereotypes that had been formed at home. So we're just going to fit that into stereotypes and use that as an example of how stereotypes affect the way we remember things, or memory distortion. So this last slide is just a little overview of what we've talked about all week. So again, if you're focusing on the formation, we are using the term illusory correlation, and we're using Hamilton and Gifford, and we are using Harris and Fisk, where our brains are making connections between things that aren't necessarily relative to everybody in that outgroup and making generalizations, which is how stereotypes are formed. If we are talking about the effects, we're talking about two different things. We are talking about stereotype threat and self-fulfilling prophecy, and then we are talking about memory distortion and how stereotypes can affect how we remember things from Martin and Halverson. So we've covered a lot of stuff this week. I know it wasn't that easy, especially not being face-to-face. So if you have questions, please pop in. But that is all for today. So class is dismissed. Stay safe.